Welcome to the Black Doctoral Network's weekly web series Conversation Starters. I'm your moderator, Dr. Kimberly West, and I am delighted that you are joining us as we discuss diversity, equity, and inclusion in leadership. During this episode, we will discuss the relationship between diversity, equity, and inclusion in leadership, the benefits and challenges of promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in leadership positions, and how leaders can promote employee engagement in diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. Our guests for this episode bring a wealth of experience and expertise. Let's get the conversation started by introducing our guest. Our first guest is Julian Nixon. Mr. Nixon is part of the College of Agriculture, Forestry, and Life Science at Clemson University, where he serves as the Director of Diversity and Inclusion. He is responsible for diversifying recruitment and retention efforts, assisting transfer students, and initiating and collaborating on collegiate and university initiatives for inclusive excellence. Mr. Nixon has a diverse background of experiences from higher education to the community leadership to TEDx. He is a College of Agriculture, Forestry, and Life Science alumni and currently an Animal and Veterinary Sciences doctoral student. Mr. Nixon currently lives with his family in Taylor, South Carolina. Welcome, Mr. Nixon.
Thank you.
Dr. Carlos Germain Richard is our second guest this evening. Dr. Richard served as the Equity and Inclusion Manager with the Department of County Human Services, Multnomah County, and is responsible for the implementation of the department's Workforce Equity Strategic Plan. Prior to joining Multnomah County, Dr. Richard served as the Director of Successful Families 2020 with the United Way of Portland in partnership with 2 of the largest school districts in Oregon and 5 of the most successful culturally specific community-based organizations working together to improve educational outcomes for students of ethnic and diverse backgrounds. Dr. Richards is a former chair and commissioner with the Oregon Commission of Black Affairs and was responsible for implementing the commission's strategic statewide plan to address systemic racism and institutional oppression that directly impacted members of the African diaspora community in housing, employment, contracting, hate crimes, and education. It's a pleasure to have you this evening, Dr. Richard.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here.
Thank you. Our final guest for this episode is Dr. Skylar Walks. Dr. Walks is a deeply impassioned diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion leader who champions social justice through critical dialogue with the hopes of impacting positive change within shared communities. As a graduate of the Adult, Professional, and Community Education Doctoral Program at Texas State University, her scholarship focused on critical race theory, Afro-Latinx identity, art activism, race, and intersectionality. Dr. Walks holds 3 bachelor's degrees in the areas of communication, English, and mass media journalism from Rutgers University, and a master's degree in early childhood education and administration from Kean University. In her current role as the inaugural Assistant Dean of Diversity and Inclusion and Professor of Instruction in the College of Pharmacy at the University of Texas at Austin, Dr. Walks serves as Chief College of Pharmacy spokesperson for diversity inclusion, while bringing leadership, vision, integrity, and intentional inclusive team-oriented philosophy to diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion efforts. Dr. Walks' professional associations include executive board member for the Texas Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education and director of university partnerships for the Black Doctoral Network. In addition to working with international, national, state, and local community organizations and institutions around intercultural education, cultural humility, juvenile justice, health outcomes, and racial inequities in healthcare, and social political reform, her roundtable work surrounding social justice in schools, universities, and neighboring communities is demonstrated in her steadfast civic engagement and community involvement. Welcome to you as well, Dr. Walks. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Indeed, I'm so happy to be here and so happy to be in the company of all of this brilliance. So thank you for the invitation.
Of course, yes. Well, again, welcome to everyone. I hope you are excited to get this conversation started this evening. And so my first question, I'm going to pose it to you, Dr. Walks. How would you describe the relationship between diversity, equity, and inclusion in leadership?
That's a great question. And quite frankly, it's a question that I wish more institutional executive leadership and C-suite leaders would consider. Quite frankly, diversity is really it's a non-action. Diversity is what it is. It's the difference, the human difference that's present in a space or in an institutional cohort, right? It doesn't necessarily lend itself to any effort or action that improves a sense of inclusion. Then we have equity, which is actually, in the way that I teach and I regard it, it's a consistent and intentional consideration to ensure that all folks present, regardless of their human differences, have access to the same opportunities, while at the same time acknowledging that there has to be an institutional effort, not strictly an interpersonal one, but an institutional effort to acknowledge and remove historical systemic barriers. And then inclusion, quite frankly, is a little different in my humble opinion. Inclusion can be fantastic, but it can also be detrimentally harmful when inclusion is in fact substituted for assimilation. So in that sense, I hope to promote belonging, which means that you do not have to change or shift in who you are to be accepted as a part of the culture in which you are a part, or of which you are a part. And so for me, the relationship is symbiotic, but it also has very clear distinctions that I think institutions have to be very responsible in acknowledging and then activating around.
Right. Mr. Nixon, what do you have to say? How would you describe that relationship between diversity, equity, and inclusion in leadership?
Definitely, I have to second everything that Dr. Walker said. Also, that diversity, inclusion, and equity, or DEI, as we sometimes nickname it behind closed doors, it has a relationship kind of like a old piece of family furniture. And if you're not careful, people become so comfortable with that piece of furniture that they don't realize when there's a piece of that furniture that's missing. And you can kind of hear it in the organization by the way they justify it, as in things like, well, this is the way it's always been done. We haven't had a problem here before. And so, DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's literally that backbone. It is that backbone piece to any change that you want to bring to your organization. And it's something that you have to constantly go back to. It's not a one and done. It is literally the backbone and the system that you are placing into your organization to be able to stabilize change and future change.
I like that analogy about the furniture. Dr. Richard, how would you describe that relationship between diversity, equity, and inclusion in leadership?
Thank you so much for my good friend, Mr. Julian and Dr. Walks. I wholeheartedly agree. Here on the West Coast in Portland, Oregon, one of the things that I challenge leaders on with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I like what Dr. Walks said about belonging, is that we cannot take these terms and sort of extrapolate them or demarcate them and use them when we want to use them in order not to accomplish the goal of inclusion and belonging. And so we also cannot allow, from a leadership perspective, to allow individuals at the C-suite level especially, but below the C-suite level as well, to get stuck on just one of these terminologies and feel comfortable with that, and stay in what Dr. Walks said is the non-action part of diversity. And a lot of individuals think as long as they got diversity or difference and they understand that and they have comprehension, that they're okay. But we got to help leaders understand that you not only must you embrace difference, but you got to accept equity. And if you accept equity, that means you acknowledge inequities. If you acknowledge inequities, that means now at the C-suite level, you have a responsibility to break down those systemic and institutional barriers. And then we also have to hold individuals accountable for that relationship simply because without belonging, we can never have inclusion. And so we got to start asking ourselves the questions from a very real perspective, from a very real purview. What does it mean for an individual to show up authentically as themselves from a diversity perspective, having access to the resources that they need so that they feel like they belong in the space and in the community where they belong?
Well, first of all, this first question out of the gate, I want to thank you, all three of you, first of all, for clarifying, because sometimes people try to just call it that DEI, right? And not clarify and think because you say DEI, oh, we got that. But I appreciate you explicitly differentiating and defining each of those components, because again, sometimes it just gets that blanket label, and it really does mean something different in each part. So I appreciate that that clarification. For the next question, I'm coming to you first, Dr. Richard. What are some benefits and some challenges in the promotion of diversity and inclusion in leadership positions?
I think I'll start with some of the challenges. Number one, the challenges is why the position exists in the first place. Now let's go back to the University of Oklahoma, when it was revealed that one of the fraternities was singing a very racist song on the bus that got recorded, that got a lot of national media attention. And we're talking about, I think, the University of Oklahoma system. Next thing you know, the president came out and denounced it. The leadership of the college, the provost and the boards and the regents came out and denounced that and said, that's not us. What was the next thing that they did? They created a chief diversity officer that reports directly to the president of the college. We have to ensure that in terms of one of the challenges, we don't create these positions just to be mannequins. We don't create these positions and then put a BIPOC person in that position to make the world seem as though we're going to do something about it. That, to me, is the greatest challenge. The second greatest challenge is putting someone in the position at a very high level, at a cabinet level or C-suite level, and then not giving the budget for implementation. Those are the challenges. Now, I think the benefits are this. If you have an individual in a position of chief diversity officer, chief equity officer, whatever the appellation is, that we allow that individual to give meaningful feedback, to give honest and transparent feedback about the current state of affairs within a particular organization or government or a corporate entity, so that change can happen. That's one of the benefits. Lastly, I'll say this. We got to get the right individual in the position. Most oftentimes than not, we put individuals in the position who may identify as BIPOC. I'm gonna get in trouble here, but at the end of the day, they might identify as BIPOC, but they have a dominant culture mentality when it comes to DEI. It can be a challenge, but it can also be a benefit if you get the right person in the position. Here's what's happening, and I think my colleagues will support me in this. Not only are the right people initially getting in the positions, but they're not lasting very long because they are seriously sincere about change.
Well, I just want to let you know, first of all, I saw Dr. Walks and giving you some snaps, Mr. Nixon also. And I just want to say, it's okay. What did John Lewis say, former Congressman John Lewis say? He says nothing but good trouble. So it's okay. All right. So Dr. Walks, I'm going to come to you. I saw you snapping, saying amen to the church. Yes, ma'am. What can you add?
Woo! Because our brother hit every single point that needed to be said. And I don't really, we could just drop the mic. I don't think there's any other way to answer this question, quite frankly, because he provided such a comprehensive and authentically honest one. Quite frankly, so I'm going to back you up. You're not in any trouble except good trouble, because quite frankly, everyone who identifies as affinity is not in community. So we have to recognize that in order to genuinely do diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion work, you must be operating under the auspice of justice. And quite frankly, that's where a lot of institutions don't want to touch the work. They want the work to be indicated in recruitment. So they want the numbers to increase. They want you to have the magic beans to make the beanstalk grow. They want you to be able to recruit faculty. They don't consider retention until afterwards, right? Because in order for folks to stay, and it's largely cultural, and I share this even within my own institution. So don't let me get started about being in the news, because I know most of y'all know about songs that's going on in the world of UT Austin right now. But in any case, I digress. My point specifically with that is you have to consider when you're talking about recruiting, you cannot make those of us who are in these positions and genuinely tethered to the work of justice around diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion, do not make us liars. Do not have us recruit our community members here and then fail to support them, give them the resources, or to formally promote and establish mentorship, networks, matrices that can actually help them to be successful, because recruiting them isn't there. And quite frankly, a lot of historically white or predominantly white institutions still operate from the premise that if we build it, it will come, as if individuals who identify as a historically underrepresented minority believe that it is a gift for us to have an open invitation to be there. That's not the choice. We have options now. We are a brilliant people. We have options now. So you have to demonstrate a very clear effort of what you're going to do to ensure that not only will we be welcome, but we're going to be supported. And beyond the interpersonal pleasantries of saying good morning and goodbye, what are you going to do to not say what are, quite frankly, micro assaults through a very colonial model that most institutions, PWIs, ascribe to, which is if you do identity specific or identity centric work, then it's niche research. I mean, there are all kinds of phrases that get tossed around in institutional spaces that are really antithetical to DEAI and justice work. So then you have scholars and faculty members who feel that they're being critiqued or silently being trivialized, their research is being trivialized as a consequence of doing identity specific or identity centric research. And then you also, quite frankly, let's be honest, there are all kinds of codified phrases that are used that diminish the relevance, the power, the significance, and the gifts that are HBCUs. When quite frankly, HBCUs are doing what PWIs can't seem to get right, and that is to successfully recruit students and have them stay. So I think there has to be, quite frankly, we talk about cultural competency, we talk about interculturalism, and we talk about DEAI, but I really think the dose of medicine that most institutions need is cultural humility. You have to acknowledge the historical injury that you have committed against communities, because we also know that town and gown mentality still exists in a lot of college towns. You got the institution that's sitting high on the hill, and you have all the marginalized folks that are essential workers that are working in service industry, right? And oftentimes there's not a symbiotic relationship that supports those community members. So I think that's important. I didn't want to be redundant with what our other doctors said, but I wanted to certainly underscore and express my deep appreciation for your expressions around that, because that is absolutely the case. And don't you dare recruit a DEAI officer and not give them a budget. How dare you? That's insulting to the work, that's insulting to the individual, and quite frankly, it sets them up to fail.
Mr. Nixon, I see you, I guess you wanted to jump in on this. I see you sitting back there clapping, shaking your head. What do you think are some of the benefits and challenges of promoting diversity?
Right now, I'm just looking for the offering bucket because this is great. I think the only thing that I can find to say after that is that I don't think that institutions and organizations realize that recruitment and retention are the same coin. Everything that you literally, if you wrote everything down in your strategic plan, if you have a strategic plan, then you would realize that the same energy, funding, resources, people and everything that you put into that recruitment plan needs to be with your retention plan. If you did that, then you would have the community that you were actually looking for. So, aside from that, I'm putting the mic down. That was awesome.
Drop the mic. All right. Well, I'm going to come. I'm sorry.
I'll add this. We cannot allow, and I'm going to pick up on what my colleague said, leadership in institutions to make the world feel good about numbers.
Mm.
The goal is to unearth policies within that organization that continue to harm and injure individuals of the African diaspora, people who are Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, Cuban, Venezuelan, Colombian. We see, this is the issue. We allow, like one university I teach at here in Portland, Oregon, they put up on their website, we are the leading university in Oregon with diversity. 63% of our staff are diverse, and we allow people to focus on numbers, but they still have dominant culture policies in place that don't allow those same 63% students of color to have the same access as white students, because the students of color don't bring as much money, or their parents don't donate as much money to that particular college. It is us who have to hold leaders accountable and say, listen, numbers are good. But as Mr. Julian said, retention is better. Numbers are good. Retention is better. That let's look at these policies that continue to stifle our recruitment. And let's also look at these policies that allow people to leave because we don't have a heart to retain.
And so what I hear you all saying is that you have to have somebody strong in there who can say to those in position or who are in, as you said, Dr. Richards, at C-suite, let's make this a reality, and let's realize and come to the grips with, or come to the truth of, it is what it is, and how can we change this? If I'm understanding you correctly, and what you're saying is, how can we make this right? And we have to face it, right? You can't just sweep it under the rug. And for the third question, I'm going to come to you, Mr. Nixon, first. How has the current political climate influenced diversity and inclusion in leadership positions?
There's practically no short answer to that, but I will use where I'm located. If you Google Clemson University, we are smack dab in the belt buckle of the Bible Belt in the South. So anything political, we can smell and see how it influences. There are things that happen. And going back to something that was said just a moment ago with Dr. Richard, you've got to make it very clear to your leadership when they do this, because sometimes they're doing it subliminally and sometimes they're really not. Sometimes they're sitting in rooms that are separate, that those of us who work in this space are not privy to. And they may say, okay, yeah, we got the diversity piece, we've got the inclusion piece, but they leave out the equity piece, because that equity piece comes back to them and says there needs to be a redistribution of power. And as long as there's no redistribution of power, then of course there's no change. And what you wind up having is that dominant culture still making the end of the day decision. So when politics comes into play, one of the things that I oftentimes look at for an organization that's making decisions is, I want to know, who are they hobnobbing with outside of the university? Because that's going to tell me a lot about our conversation. I say, hey, look, can we have a conversation that is not going to bring a political agenda in this? If not, then where can we meet? Because it's going to get down to a place where equity is going to wind up being taken out of this conversation, and that's going to be absolutely pointless. And we saw it last year in 2020. You saw people. 2020. The best thing about 2020 for my area where I work is that it literally made everybody take a pop quiz, and their grade was posted public. Because we had to look at one another via Zoom every single day in the midst of that. And when you walk into leadership meetings on Zoom 3 days later after George Floyd is murdered, and people are having trouble looking at you, and they're wondering, do I leave this background on my Zoom up or do I take it down? They're coming to that realization, maybe having this cotton field in the background of my Zoom screen is actually offensive after all. So you can kind of use some political issues to kind of bring about change in a way, but at the same time, you have to hold your leadership accountable that they're not leaning back on their own political views to remove equity out of situations.
Dr. Walks, how's the current political climate influence your area?
Well, I think two things. I think one, I'm very dubious about any institution, any organization, or any leadership team that expresses a desire to improve efforts around diversity, equity, accessibility, inclusion, and justice, and say it has to be done apolitically. Quite frankly, race and most marginalized, if not all marginalized identities are political. So if there's a failure to acknowledge that within the context of the laws, within the context of the policies, oftentimes created for gatekeeping alone against some marginalized identities, then that lets me know that they're not yet ready to confront the historical relationship that has consequently resulted in a reality lived by those who are being impacted by the policies that are political and that are a consequence of their identity. So that's number one. Number two, so I'm always dubious. That's a telltale sign. If they are having a conversation, I don't care how good the lunch restaurant is they took you to, they let you order dessert to. If they say something, but it has to be apolitical, we've got to be careful about our constituency and our donors, then I know they're not really ready to create the seismic shift that's going to transform the institution and the institutional practices and policies. The second thing I would say is similar to Dr. Nixon there. And that is, quite frankly, it was a mixed bag for me. I was both pragmatically optimistic about the fury of an energy that went into creating diversity statements on May 26, 2020. But I was also, quite frankly, a little frustrated and again, incredulous, because my question was, where have you been? And also, welcome. And I say, where have you been? Because there was, and we have to own this, and if you use this term, please cite me, because that's a whole other issue about Black scholarship, most specifically with Black women. Our intellectual property is used and cited all the time, and we are not credited appropriately. So a Schuylerism, if you use it, cite a sister, is this, there was to me, a devastating demonstration of what I call benevolent apathy of whiteness, which is different than willful indifference, because willful indifference means there was the intention to disregard, ignore, and negate. But benevolent apathy, I think, speaks to what we experience in a hegemonically white, cisgendered male space with respect to power and influence. And that is benevolent apathy. That means that you don't have to feel badly about anything that's happening because you don't necessarily know, and it doesn't mean that you're for it, but you're not necessarily working to combat it, but you have goodwill, right? So that's the benevolence. That's just as dangerous as willful indifference. It's just as dangerous because it still results in the marginalization of others. It still results in the state-sanctioned persecution of others. And so here's the last thing I'll say about that. The third thing, because I gave you the first two, is how incredibly short the attention span of most of our American brothers and sisters and siblings is. How incredibly short it is. Because it was after the checks were written, the donate buttons were clicked, the Amazon top 10 anti-racism bestsellers were purchased. They've gathered dust now on the bookshelves. Folks have very slowly but assuredly returned to business as usual. And that, for me, is where I said before, my cynical optimism kicks in. Because I actually am not surprised. But we have to continue to work to advance the work. And I think that comes, quite frankly, from an ancestral generation memory that most of us possess who identify as we do, who do this work, even before the titles came to us. Because we're not waiting for the results. We're doing it because we know we don't have a choice. We have to commit to the change, even if we don't see it operationalized.
Dr. Richard, what can you add to this? First of all, I'm still thinking about what Mr. Nixon said about the cotton virtual backgrounds. I'm going, and then Dr. Walks, what could you add to that about the current political climate?
I think Dr. Julie and Dr. Walks, listen, I'm gonna just do a mic drop, right? What can you say? Here's what I'll add to this question. The signs or the signage, the statements on company websites now has to match their action. A lot of individuals, every time something tragic happens in a BIPOC space, what this political climate has done, it has taught individuals in power to put up a statement that you condemn or a statement that you disagree, but they're not held accountable to the action. Dr. Walks talked about the benevolence. So what? From your government organization or from your corporate institution, you donated money to the community, but you actually have not addressed the issue of inequities that continue to exist. How in the world does a Black man in the 21st century die from having a knee in his neck? You know why that happens? Because at the end of the day, there's outrage, there's fury, there's emotion. Dr. Walks talked about it. The memory is shortened because they'll fire a police officer. Firing one police officer does not equate to change. The system, the militaristic system, using the George Floyd case as an example, the militaristic system of the Fraternal Order of Police still exists. This is not an indictment on all law enforcement. It's an indictment on the system that continues to protect them. And so at the end of the day, this political climate cannot just give permission for individuals to put signs up in their yards, signs up in their windows, CEOs and presidents to put a statement on their website, board presidents and board chairmen or chairwomen to put up a statement condemning the violence. You can condemn, but now let's take the next step and address the inequity and repair. Now we got to get to reparations. Now we got to get to restorative justice. Now we got to get to making people whole. So I'm with you, Dr. Walks and Dr. Nixon. I could care less about a sign. When I go on my morning walks in Portland, Oregon, Dr. West, there's a house I walk by. I go on 5-mile walks. There's a house I walk by every day on the way home. White silence is violence. And so many times I want to knock on that door and say, what are you doing about the violence in your own community? So if the silence of folks in your community is violence, what are you doing about the violence? So again, we cannot allow the political climate to throw things at us to make us feel good, to give us money, but the system remains in place.
Okay, drop that mic. Now, I'm excited about these next few questions because it gets into what you were saying, Dr. Richard, the action part. What can be done? So I'm gonna come to you first, Dr. Walks. What are effective strategies that leaders can implement to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in organizational settings?
Well, I think the first thing is it's not just about strategies. And the reason why I say that, and I want to problematize language that we're using, is that most institutions believe that there are a set of strategies that they can employ and they can tick those boxes and good will be done. It's far more complex than that. It's far, far more complex than that because there has to be restoration. And as I shared before in different spaces when doing this work, one of the critical things about restorative justice work is to acknowledge first that there is injury. to understand why what was done was injurious to those who were harmed. And then thirdly, to understand that there has to be an acknowledgement by the individual that did the injuring. So the truth telling is the only way to inch towards absolution. But if you don't tell the truth, there's no way to get to the healing. And most people misunderstand restorative justice, and they think that if you come together and you have a warm and fuzzy circle and you talk about the harm that was done, you're suddenly healed. No, you have to tell the truth in that. The individual who's done the harm has to tell the truth. And more than that, the hardest part for folks to understand, especially when it comes to the isms and the IAs, meaning transphobia, homophobia, etc., is that the individuals who are injured are not obligated to forgive. They are only obligated to commit to advancing the work of collective community. I want that to sit with the group for a moment, because far too often the expectation is that since we're trying to work towards healing, the individuals who have experienced injury, oftentimes for decades and even centuries, as a consequence for daring to exist, have to somehow, based on an apology which often feels void and empty to those who experience the injury, that they somehow are resolved to mammying, to forgiving, to being okay, and then nurturing you in your guilt. It doesn't work that way. Restoration work insists that you have to acknowledge the injury, you have to tell the truth about the injury, and then and only then can you move toward the prospect of healing. But the healing does not include an apology or an absolution of responsibility for the injury. So I believe that those are critical things to consider when we're talking about what can leaders implement. It's an acknowledgement of what you've done. It doesn't have to be you. It's not personal. And that's one of the hardest things to drive home with institutions. It's not about you. Move the ego aside. It's not about you. It's not about you. It may not be about your daddy. It may not be about your mama. It's about the system. So acknowledge the injury that the system has caused, and then tell the truth about it. Rather than say it wasn't me, like that Shaggy song from the 90s, tell the truth about it. Just say this happened. And there is nothing that we can do to make what happened in the past better, but this is what we will commit to restore. And that, for some reason, seems to be the impasse with most institutions. And that's where humility comes into play.
You have, so because of your wisdom, I'm going to just rephrase the question. For you, Dr. Richard, what do you think? What approach would you use if that makes it sound a little bit better? Because again, that is a nugget you have dropped on me, Dr. Walks. What can be done, sir? What should they do? How can you move forward to, what can leaders do?
I think every leader who sits in a leadership chair that has power and decision-making attached to it cannot kick the can down the road or say, I didn't do this. This global push for unity without a restorative justice process or restoration scares me. Because I'm trying to understand, why do people want to be unified with me? And as Dr. Walk said, you have not acknowledged the hurt, neither have you acknowledged your white privilege and how you have benefited from 438 years of the oppression of people of color, African folks, and you have benefited financially. So at the end of the day, anybody who sits in a chair of power, position, privilege, and authority cannot kick the can down the road. They have to deal with it. This is not about compromise. This is not about how we can get along. This is not about where we can meet in the middle. No, we have to acknowledge that the only reason why this individual may be sitting in this chair is because of some atrocities that were committed that now affords them the opportunity to sit in a chair that I more than likely will never be able to sit in. At the end of the day, this statement is starting to scare me more and more. And my dad used to talk to me about this. My dad was from Arkansas. When when our leaders, some of our Black leaders say, well, you know, Black folks are the most forgiving people on the planet. I get that. I understand that. But at the end of the day, do I have to forgive? How can I forgive when there has not been a sincere apology? And so when we talk about strategies, when we talk about methodologies, when we talk about what needs to be done, we have to hold individuals accountable who sit in the chair, who have the power and the position and the decision-making authority to make things right. And again, without holding individuals accountable, you know, so we can put in a strategy for recruitment and get more Black folks or more Asian folk or more Latinx folk. We can put in a strategy to hire more people at the C-suite level, but that does not resolve the issue of promoting equity, diversity, and inclusion in an organizational setting. First of all, you got to acknowledge me. How? Listen, I'm gonna share this very briefly. You know, I got a doctorate. You know, I went back to school. My daddy told me to go back to school, and I was afraid he was gonna get out of his grave if I didn't finish. And individuals have a problem calling me Dr. Richard, but they don't have a problem calling a white person Dr., Mr., Ma'am, or Sir. So first of all, you got to acknowledge that we are in the room. You can't promote diversity, equity, or inclusion unless you first acknowledge that we are in the space, that we contribute, that I don't let people get away with saying, oh yes, Black lives have always mattered. If Black lives have always mattered, how come we are still behind the 8 ball in every category in America? So I love, Dr. West, how you flip that question based on Dr. Walk's comments, simply because it's not about a strategy. For me, there has to first be an acknowledgement before we can even talk strategy.
Come on. So, Mr. Nixon, I wanted you to take it a little step further. So what can leaders do? How can leaders address stereotypes and prejudices that threaten DEI in organizational practices?
So those individuals and you know, leadership, and especially in the area of higher education, leadership has to get to a place where they're not picking all of their training. That's old. That's done. You get tired of walking into a meeting and C-suite people come in and they name all the special workshops. They went out to Las Vegas and they went to this 1 week entertainment / training on DEI, and they come back and they have their 3 pieces that they're going to brag to you that they're going to nail in. And no, those things were marketed and tailored to their enjoyment. They need an immersive environment where their title and privilege does not matter. And I was in a poverty simulator that was, I call it an extreme poverty simulator, because they had us sitting in rooms on floors. People were imitating dying. It was a full day event. And so if your person died, you literally were laying on the floor a full day. And this one lady who was she was a VP for a bank or something like that. She quit. She quit after an hour because she demanded a chair. But we were in the room where we were in the social economic class where we couldn't afford any of that. And she couldn't deal with that, literally, psychologically. And so she quit the event that day because we wouldn't give her a chair. And that's the kind of thing that needs to happen if you're going to take that, go from stereotype dealing with cultural differences. You've got to get people to get immersed, remove that title, and get them to see exactly what their privilege has actually and truly and honestly afforded them, because the knowledge that they've built thus far is knowledge from those events that they went to Las Vegas from, the books that they've read. They have not engaged with the actual community that they are boasting to actually help and be with. And quite frankly, they got to ask another question. They got to say, am I selling or am I serving? because there's a definitive difference. Don't sell to my community. If you're going to really serve in my community, there's a whole nother step to that. And I'm gonna step away from the mic and let someone else go for that.
Dr. Richard, would you like to chime in?
There is nothing that I can add. I put in the chat, team, I was sorry because I absolutely did a mic drop for Dr. Walks and Dr. Nixon. Let's go on to the next question. I believe the producer said there's a question in the chat for Dr. Walks.
Yes.
I yield.
Yeah. All right. So there is a question, and if I mispronounce your name, I'm sorry. But it seems like Rubana says, although I agree with your positions, but I raise this question. DEI seems to imply justice for Black or African Americans. Is DEI only about Black African American injustices in the workplace? Dr. Walks, what do you think?
Great question. I'm so glad that question was raised. So I'm going to try to be, I want to respect time and brevity here. So I'll try to be as concise as possible. And this is all evidence-based through research and scholarship. So I don't want anyone to think because I'm showing up in this space, in this body, unapologetically so, that that's the premise for my response. So let me be clear. The first is that we have to understand the historical origins in this country with respect to race and the construction of race. Race was constructed very much with a clear hierarchy. Whiteness was on top, Blackness was on bottom. Does that mean that any and every stratification in between does not matter? Absolutely not. But we do know that those are the bars. As such, whiteness is what individuals who can assimilate, because we have to understand that most cultures can assimilate through other things. Black folk do not have the choice of assimilating. Even Black folks who hold hegemonic or dominant ideologies of whiteness cannot assimilate to whiteness. Okay, so let's be very clear about that. As such, historically, in the US context, because I'm gonna flip it in a second for you, in the US context, we also have to understand that there is anti-Blackness in people of color communities. That is very clear. So colonialism, think of that as the grandfather. Then we have racism, that's the child. Then we have colorism, that's the grandchild. And quite frankly, it is colonialism that accounts for anti-Blackness, even when not named as such, in people of color communities. We have to also recognize that for every policy that was passed related to equal opportunity and civil rights, it was passed as a consequence and based on the historical lived realities and policies that disproportionately affected and impacted African Americans in this country. That doesn't mean it was only for African Americans, but it was absolutely the catalyst or impetus to change or transform policies that as a consequence benefited every other marginalized group. Okay. The second thing we have to understand is that African Americans did not immigrate into the United States. So that it makes it very complicated and complex in the way that we understand policies that have marginalized us historically for centuries. We have one of the most debased, which is the one drop rule. And in the US context, the one drop rule is such that if you have a drop of Black blood in you, you are Black, you are African American. It is indisputable. It doesn't matter if you are octoroon, quadroon, how you might try to stratify your distance from Blackness, you are still Black. In places like Brazil, where I did my research, in Cuba, you have, even in the Dominican Republic, even in Puerto Rico, you have national identity that supersedes racial identity. But even in the context of places like Brazil, and even in the context of places like Cuba and many other Afro-Latinx cultures and communities, the one drop rule is actually the reverse. If you have one drop of whiteness, you don't have to identify as Black. So one of the things that I want us to understand when we do that is to not get into the dangerous waters, which is to somehow misinterpret that the centering of the African American experience as one of the most explicitly marginalized does in no way create to create a competitive edge around oppression Olympics, right? We're not saying, because we're centering the experiences of African Americans as a baseline in understanding the travesty of injustice as it relates to systemic injustice and the policies created to further those injustices, because they were done so not exclusively, but done so disproportionately to African Americans in the US. We just have to be mindful that when Black folk are free, and I'm gonna take it a step further, when I said welcome, I was also not just talking about George Floyd, I was talking about Tatiana Jefferson, I was talking about Breonna Taylor, because we have to bring intersectionality into this conversation, which incredibly Kimberly Crenshaw coined, but the term itself was actually, its origins were in the Combahee River Collective, right? So we have to understand that it is poor Black women who are actually the most disenfranchised and marginalized. So when they are free, we are all free.
You just gave a word there, ma'am. You just spoke a word right there. I want to come to you, Mr. Nixon. How important is employee engagement when developing a formal workplace diversity and inclusion program?
It's literally everything. If you're creating a strategic plan without the employees at a central focus within that, then you're back to what we were talking about 30 minutes ago, where you have taken equity out, you put diversity and inclusion in, and we're still at the end of the day focusing the power and the decision making with a select dominant group. And so, you know, I'll say this because I know we're short on time. The last thing I will say about that is that your strategic plan, you got to have what the end in mind. There was a guy that said something years ago. He said, "Think steps, not programs." And so quickly they're saying, well, they'll call someone into a room, especially a BIPOC person. They'll say, "What program can you create to make us look good in the midst of this tragedy, so that when someone comes and counts how many people who look like you are here, that we'll have something in place to excuse why we don't have enough people around here that look like you." And that's not the thing. We have to think steps. And if you're going to think steps, then you got to think about the people. And if you're going to think about people, then you got to think with an internal mindset as well. So what are you changing internally in your people? What are you offering them? What are you giving them? What is the spirit of your organization? Where are you going with that? And how is the spirit of your organization influencing those people and their communities as well? And all of those questions have to be brought to the table before you turn around and say, we're going to have a strategic plan. And all of that in turn is also going to affect how your employees are involved. And do your employees even feel like they're involved? And that's a whole nother story. I'll stop right there.
And so I want to come to you, Dr. Richard. Again, just such great words of wisdom from everyone tonight. How can leaders leverage community collaborations to develop diverse, equitable, and inclusive organizations?
Well, I think leaders have to understand what exactly is in their particular and specific community. A lot of times leaders don't know what's out there because they have not taken that step to engage with community leaders, especially when we talk about government and in some cases, educational institutions. We're so busy trying to offer, as Dr. Nixon said, or sell things instead of going out to build rapport and build relationship. That, I think, is the key thing that's missing in terms of leveraging that, is the fact that if we don't build relationships in our communities, we don't know what's out there. And so this, for me, goes beyond just having a job fair or a college career fair. Although those are effective, I think there is merit in doing a job fair or a career fair or some type of college fair. I think we have to go deeper because community has to become co-creator and co-collaborator for what is taking place within an organization. If there are no individuals around the table making the decisions or helping to make decisions or even asking the questions at the end of the day, we are going to have the same dominant culture system where we bring you something that we expect you to choose option A, B, or C, when neither A, B, or C has anything to do with what I need in my community. So if I like collard greens, do not bring me rhubarb. I don't eat rhubarb. I eat collard greens. So give me something so I can plant some collard greens, some mustard greens, some turnip greens. But so many times when we don't leverage the wisdom, the prowess, the ingenuity that is within the community gets handed something that they never got a chance to vote on. We call this redlining. We call this gentrification. We call this racism. We call this institutional and systemic oppression. Right? So in order for leaders to engage with community, you got to go inside the community. So go into the home, right? Don't just walk down the block, go into the home, right? Don't invite them to your shop. You go to their shop and understand how we communicate with individuals to ensure that we are meeting the community's needs.
Wow. I wish we had more time. I wish we had more time. To bring a close to our conversation, I just want to know, you're here this evening, you've shared with us your expertise. Dr. Walks, I want to come to you first. How has your affiliation with the Black Doctoral Network helped to enhance you professionally and or personally?
Well, I think one of the things that the Black Doctoral Network has done for me, and I'm probably not alone in this, is to make visible what has actually been mythologized, right? Which is that there is only a very small amount in community of individuals who identify as Black and possess a credential that includes a doctoral degree, right? Or a doctorate. And I think one of the things that's really important, quite frankly, just to the emotional health and psychological health of showing up in academic spaces that were not designed to serve us, that were not designed to include us, and to know that we have an affinity space where we can have a collective, quite frankly, community. We can have a collective brotherhood, sisterhood. We have experienced some of the same collective traumas, but we refuse to let that be a trauma bond, right? Our bond is based on who we are. It's affirming the talents and the expertise and the scholarship that we produce, but knowing that because we come from Afro-indigeneity, that is not who we are. It is simply a part of what we are and what we do. And I think that is a very distinctive difference, quite frankly, for me and my connection to BDN versus other professional organizations, because our credentials, although it's in the name of the organization, are not who we are. They are understood to be a part of who we are. So they are an asset, but they are not our identity. And I think that speaks very, very clearly to who we are, quite frankly, as a collectivist culture of Black folks. We are more than those things. We are sisters. We are brothers. We love to dance. We love to talk. We are community activists. We are all of these things, and we happen to have this credential. So I appreciate the very clear affirmation and community that it has created. We are not unicorns, but we are certainly extraordinary.
Yes, I'm here for it. Mr. Julian, I pose this same question to you. How has the affiliation with BDN helped enhance you personally or professionally?
I can say personally, being what they used to call a non-traditional student, having a family, having a full-time job and everything, it's easy to get disconnected from the doctoral process. There are all the different pieces that go into obtaining your doctorate. And you constantly find yourself stepping away from it. And being a part of this network, it basically gives me empowerment through belonging, because I see all of these individuals who look like me, even though I'm constantly in a STEM space where I don't see me, or if I do see me, it's almost by accident. Instead, in this space, there's nothing accidental about this. There's nothing accidental about greatness. And it's a constant reminder that you belong in this space and that you belong to a mighty many people that is transforming and revolutionizing this planet. And that's extremely important to me, because if I'm getting that, then that's what I'm going to give to other people.
Yes. And last but certainly definitely not least, Dr. Richard, come on with it, sir. How has your affiliation with BDN helped to enhance you professionally and or personally?
Thank you so much, Dr. West, and to my two esteemed colleagues, Dr. Walks and Dr. Nixon. For me, it's about community, it's about collaboration, it's about connection. When I attended the Western Regional BDN conference and saw the virtual space with so many Black credentialed academic intellectuals, I was almost taken back, because I'm out here in Portland, Oregon, and sometimes in the academic space, it gets very, very lonely, where I do show up many times as one of a few, or sometimes the only African-American credentialed professor. So for me, this connection that helps me with development, growth, thought leadership, thought partnership, the ability to sit in the presence of other academic professionals and learn, really is the catalyst in terms of how this has helped me want to continue on in the space with my colleagues. So again, the 3 C's for me: community, collaboration, and connection has really helped me be the person that I have become since I've earned my doctorate a few years ago.
Wow. Again, I wish we had more time, but I thank you so very much for such an enriching conversation this evening. And so can you please tell everyone how they can get in contact with you? Mr. Nixon, how can people who are interested get in contact with you?
You can reach me through email. My email is jenixon@clemson.edu. Also, if you go to the website and you just type in my name in the search for clemson.edu, I'll pop up. I'm the only Julian there, so that helps. Or you can reach out to me on Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn. You can type in my name, Julian Nixon, and I'll pop up.
Thank you so much. Dr. Richard.
You can reach me, email address. I believe it's on the screen right now. Also, I'm on LinkedIn as well. Those two mediums you can reach me and connect. So yeah, email and then LinkedIn page.
All right. And Dr. Walks, how can folks get in contact with you?
It's the same email and LinkedIn.
All right. Well, again, thank you. And thank you to everyone who joins us this evening for a wonderful conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion in leadership positions. Please join us on next Friday for another great conversation starters, and also connect with us on all our social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and also Clubhouse. Have a wonderful evening. And until next time, have a great weekend.